The winter of 1412 descended upon the village of Ashworth like a curse whispered by dying lips. Snow fell without mercy, burying the roads, the fields, the very memory of warmth beneath its relentless white shroud. The wind howled through the naked trees like the lamentations of forgotten souls, and the sky hung low and gray, as though the heavens themselves had turned their face away from the suffering below. Eleanor Ashford stood at the frost-covered window of her cottage, her breath forming small clouds against the glass. At 24 years, she had already known more sorrow than most would endure in a lifetime. Her husband, William, a blacksmith of gentle heart and steady hands, had been taken by fever 3 winters past, leaving her with nothing but this small cottage, a garden that yielded barely enough to survive, and a silence that filled every corner of her days. She had been beautiful once, or so they said. Her hair, the color of autumn chestnuts, still fell in thick waves to her waist, and her eyes, gray-green like the sea before a storm, still held a light that suffering had not quite extinguished. But beauty meant little in a village where survival was measured in firewood and salted meat, and Eleanor had long since stopped thinking of herself as anything other than what she was: a widow, alone, forgotten by fortune and fate alike. The sound came to her first as a trick of the wind, a thin, reedy cry that might have been a wounded animal or a branch breaking under the weight of snow. But something in its timbre made her pause, made her set down the mending she had been working on and move toward the door. She opened it to a blast of frozen air that stole her breath and stung her eyes. The world beyond was a swirling chaos of white, the familiar landmarks of her yard, the well, the woodpile, the path to the village, erased by the storm's fury. She was about to retreat back inside when the cry came again, closer now, unmistakably human. Eleanor grabbed her heaviest cloak and plunged into the snow. She found him at the edge of the forest, a small figure curled beneath an ancient oak whose branches groaned and creaked above him like the ribs of a dying giant. He was a child, a boy of perhaps 6 or 7 years, dressed in clothes that had once been fine, but were now torn and soaked through with snow and something darker. Blood. A gash across his temple had painted half his face in crimson, and his lips were blue with cold. For a single terrible moment, Eleanor thought he was dead. But when she knelt beside him and gathered his small body into her arms, she felt the faintest flutter of breath against her cheek, the weakest tremor of a heart refusing to surrender. "Hold on," she whispered fiercely, clutching him against her chest. "Hold on, little one. I have you now." She carried him back through the storm, her legs burning with the effort, her arms aching from his weight. By the time she reached the cottage, she was gasping for breath, her body trembling from cold and exertion. But she did not stop. She laid him on the pallet beside the fire, stripped away his frozen clothes, and wrapped him in every blanket she possessed. For 3 days and 3 nights the boy hovered between life and death. His fever burned so hot that Eleanor feared it would consume him from within, and his sleep was haunted by terrors she could not see. He thrashed and moaned, crying out names she did not recognize, begging unseen enemies for mercy. She did not leave his side. She bathed his wound with herbs and honey, spooned broth between his cracked lips, and held his hand through the darkest hours when his breathing grew shallow and his pulse grew weak. She prayed to every saint she knew, and some she invented, bargaining with heaven for the life of a child whose name she did not even know. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. Eleanor was dozing in her chair when she felt it, a change in the air, a shift in the quality of silence. She opened her eyes to find the boy watching her, his gaze clear and alert for the first time since she had found him. His eyes, she saw now, were a remarkable shade of blue, pale and luminous like winter ice touched by morning light. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You are safe," Eleanor said, moving to sit beside him on the edge of the pallet. "You are in my home in the village of Ashworth. I found you in the forest, nearly frozen to death. Do you remember?" The boy's brow furrowed, and a shadow passed across his face. "I remember. Running. Men with torches. screaming. He swallowed hard, and Eleanor saw the terror that still lived behind his eyes. They killed them. They killed everyone. Eleanor's heart clenched. Who, child? Who did this to you? But the boy shook his head, his small hands gripping the blanket. I cannot say. I dare not. He looked at her then, and in his gaze she saw something that no child should ever carry. A weight of knowledge, a burden of secrets too heavy for such young shoulders. If I tell you, they will come for you too. Eleanor reached out and took his hands in hers. Listen to me, she said, her voice firm but gentle. I do not know who you are or where you came from. I do not know what horrors you have witnessed or what dangers pursue you. But I know this. You are a child, and you are alone, and you are in need of protection. I will give you that protection, no matter what. The boy stared at her for a long moment, as though trying to determine whether she could be trusted, whether her words were more than empty promises made by a stranger. Then slowly, something in his face softened. My name is Thomas, he said quietly. Or at least, that is what you may call me. Eleanor smiled, though her heart was heavy with questions she knew she could not ask. Thomas, then. Welcome to my home, Thomas. You may stay as long as you need. In the weeks that followed, Thomas grew stronger. The color returned to his cheeks, the wound on his temple healed to a thin scar, and his appetite became that of any healthy boy his age, which is to say, ravenous and insatiable. He helped Eleanor with chores around the cottage, his small hands surprisingly capable and his manner surprisingly refined. He could read, a rare skill for a child of any station, and his speech, though he tried to hide it, bore the careful diction of nobility. Eleanor noticed these things, stored them away in her mind like pieces of a puzzle she was not yet ready to solve. She did not press him for answers. Whatever secrets Thomas carried, he would share them when he was ready. Until then, she would simply give him what he needed most, a home, a hearth, and a heart that cared for him. She did not know then how profoundly this small, wounded boy would change her life. She did not know that in saving him, she had set in motion a chain of events that would lead her to places she had never imagined, to dangers she could not foresee, and to a love so deep and unexpected that it would remake her entirely. But fate, as it so often does, was already weaving its threads. And the first of those threads arrived on a gray morning in late February, in the form of a rider approaching through the melting snow. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If stories of courage, love, and impossible hope speak to your soul, then you belong here with us. Subscribe now and become part of a family that believes in the power of stories to heal what the world has broken. The rider appeared like a specter from the mist, a dark figure on a dark horse, moving slowly along the muddy road that wound through Ashworth. Eleanor saw him from the window where she stood kneading bread, and her hands stilled on the dough, her heart seizing with sudden fear. Thomas, she called softly, keeping her voice calm. Go to the back room and stay there until I call for you. Thomas, who had been practicing his letters by the fire, looked up with wide eyes. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded and slipped away, silent as a shadow. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the door, positioning herself in the threshold so that whoever approached would have to go through her to enter. She was not a fool. She knew that Thomas was being hunted, that somewhere out in the world there were men who wanted him. Whether to harm him or to use him, she did not know. But she had made a promise, and she intended to keep it. The rider drew closer, and Eleanor was able to make out more details through the gray drizzle. His horse was a destrier, a war horse, its coat black as midnight, its bearing proud despite the mud that caked its legs. The rider himself was tall and broad-shouldered, wrapped in a traveling cloak that had once been fine but was now weathered and worn. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but Eleanor could feel his gaze upon her, assessing, calculating. He reined to a stop before the cottage and dismounted in a single fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. When he pushed back his hood, Eleanor found herself looking at a man perhaps 5 years her senior, with dark hair that fell to his shoulders and a face that was striking in its contradictions. A strong jaw softened by full lips, sharp cheekbones tempered by eyes that were unexpectedly kind. A scar ran along his left cheek from the corner of his eye to the edge of his jaw, pale against his weathered skin. "Good morning," he said, his voice deep and measured. "I am looking for shelter from the rain. I can pay if coin is your concern." Eleanor did not move from the doorway. "There is an inn in the village, half a mile down the road." The man's mouth curved in something that was not quite a smile. "I am aware of the inn. I am also aware that inns are places where people ask questions and remember faces. I am seeking discretion, and you think you will find that here, at a stranger's door?" "I think," the man said slowly, "that a woman who lives alone in a cottage at the edge of a village is unlikely to welcome visitors or spread gossip. I think she values her privacy as much as I value mine." He paused, and something flickered in his dark eyes. "I also think she is protecting something, or someone." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, but she forced herself to remain still. "I do not know what you mean." The man studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the unsettling sensation that he could see straight through her words, her pretense, her fear. Then slowly, he raised both hands, palms outward, in a gesture of surrender. "Peace, mistress. I am not your enemy." He reached up and unfastened his cloak, revealing beneath it the worn but unmistakable armor of a knight. A breastplate scarred by battle, a sword at his hip, a dagger in his boot. "My name is—" "Well, my name does not matter. What matters is that I am hunted, just as I suspect you are. Or rather, just as I suspect whoever you are hiding is." Eleanor's breath caught. "How do you—" "Because I have eyes," the man said quietly. "Because I saw the way you looked at me when I approached. Not with the wariness of a woman protecting herself, but with the fierce, desperate terror of a mother protecting her young. Because there are fresh tracks in the mud behind your cottage, child-sized, leading to the woodpile and back. Because the boy you are sheltering is the same boy half the realm is searching for." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the knife at her belt, a small blade meant for cutting herbs and mending rope, but sharp enough to wound if she struck true. "Peace," the man said again, his voice gentle now. "I told you, I am not your enemy. Quite the opposite." He took a step closer, and Eleanor forced herself not to retreat. "My name is Sir Marcus Thorne. I was a knight in the service of the Earl of March, the true Earl of March, before his household was slaughtered, and his heir vanished into the night. I have spent 3 months searching for that heir, not to capture him, but to protect him." Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. "The Earl of March," she repeated slowly. "Thomas. He mentioned men with torches. A massacre." Marcus nodded, his expression grim. "The boy's name is not Thomas. It is Edmund. Edmund Mortimer, nephew of the late Earl and, by right of blood, one of the strongest claimants to the throne of England." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "There are powerful men who want him dead, mistress. Men who fear what he represents, what he could become. I have sworn an oath to keep him safe, and I have followed his trail here, to this village, to your door." Eleanor's legs felt weak beneath her. She reached out to steady herself against the door frame, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Thomas, Edmund, a claimant to the throne. It explained everything. His fine clothes, his education, his terror. And it meant that the danger she had sensed from the beginning was far greater than she had ever imagined. "Why should I believe you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How do I know you are not one of the men who hunted him?" Marcus met her gaze without flinching. You do not. You have only my word, and I know that the word of a stranger is worth little in times like these. He reached into his tunic and withdrew a small object which he held out to her. But perhaps this will speak for me. Eleanor took the object and examined it. It was a ring, a signet ring, heavy in gold, bearing an intricate coat of arms that she did not recognize. But Thomas Edmund would. Show this to the boy, Marcus said. Ask him if he knows the crest of the Mortimer house. If he does not, I will leave and trouble you no further. But if he does... He let the sentence hang, unfinished. Eleanor looked at the ring, then at the man who had given it to her. Every instinct she possessed screamed at her to send him away, to bolt the door and pretend this conversation had never happened. But something in his eyes, something weary and haunted and strangely vulnerable, made her hesitate. Wait here, she said finally. Do not move. She found Edmund in the back room, crouched behind a barrel of salted fish, his face pale with fear. When she showed him the ring, his eyes went wide, and he reached for it with trembling hands. This belonged to my uncle, he whispered, tracing the crest with his fingertip. He wore it always. He said it was the symbol of our house, our legacy. He looked up at Eleanor, tears glistening in his eyes. Where did you get this? There is a man outside, Eleanor said carefully. A knight. He says his name is Sir Marcus Thorne, and he says he has come to protect you. Edmund's breath hitched. Sir Marcus? He is alive? A sob escaped him, and he pressed the ring to his chest. He was my uncle's most trusted knight. He taught me to ride, to hold a sword. I thought they had killed him with the others. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, a door opening, a decision being made. Then I suppose we had better let him in. Marcus Thorne sat by Eleanor's fire, a cup of weak ale in his hands, and told them everything. He spoke of the Earl of March, a good man, a just man, who had died 3 years past and left his young nephew Edmund as his heir. He spoke of the regency that had been established to govern the Mortimer lands until Edmund came of age, and of the enemies who had seen in the boy's minority an opportunity to advance their own ambitions. He spoke of the night the household had been attacked, the screams, the flames, the chaos, and of his own desperate flight, wounded and half-mad with grief, believing that everyone he had sworn to protect was dead. I learned only later that Edmund had escaped, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A servant saw him flee into the forest. I have been searching ever since, following rumors and whispers, always one step behind those who hunt him. And who are these hunters? Eleanor asked, her hands wrapped around her own cup, untouched and growing cold. Who would murder a child for the sake of ambition? Marcus's jaw tightened. There are several factions. The most dangerous is led by the Earl of Northumberland, a man who has long coveted the Mortimer lands and who sees Edmund as an obstacle to his designs. But there are others, too. Men at court who fear that Edmund's claim to the throne could destabilize the realm. Men who would rather see him dead than risk the chaos his existence represents. Edmund, who had been listening in silence, spoke up in a small voice. They will never stop looking for me, will they? Marcus turned to him, and Eleanor saw the knight's hard features soften with something like tenderness. No, my lord, they will not, which is why we cannot stay here. Ashworth is too exposed, too close to the main roads. Eventually someone will come asking questions, and eventually someone will talk. He glanced at Eleanor. We must move north to a place I know, a priory near the Scottish border, where the sisters are loyal to the Mortimer cause. You will be safe there until I can gather allies and plan our next move. We, Eleanor repeated. I am not part of this, Sir Marcus. I am a seamstress, a widow. I have no place in the affairs of earls and kings. Marcus studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze made her cheeks warm despite herself. You saved his life, he said quietly. You took him in, cared for him, protected him when you had no reason to do so and every reason to turn him away. Whether you like it or not, Mistress Ashford, you are part of this now." He paused. "And frankly, I could use your help. The boy trusts you. He will need that trust in the days ahead." Eleanor looked at Edmund, who was watching her with wide, hopeful eyes. She thought of her quiet life in Ashworth, the mending, the garden, the long empty evenings by the fire. She thought of William, who had been dead for 3 years now and who would never have wanted her to spend the rest of her days in lonely grief. And she thought of the way her heart had leaped when Marcus Thorne had pushed back his hood and revealed a face that was somehow both fierce and kind, scarred and beautiful. "Very well," she heard herself say. "I will come." They left Ashworth 2 nights later, under cover of darkness, with only what they could carry on their backs. Marcus led the way on his great black destrier, with Edmund perched before him in the saddle. Eleanor followed on a sturdy mare that Marcus had procured from a farmer in exchange for a handful of silver coins. The journey north was long and hard. They traveled by night and rested by day, avoiding the main roads and keeping to the forests and moors where few ventured. The weather was bitter, the ground treacherous, and more than once Eleanor wondered what madness had possessed her to leave the safety of her cottage for this desperate flight through hostile country. But then she would look at Edmund, wrapped in Marcus's cloak and sleeping peacefully against the knight's broad chest, and she would remember why she had come. And she would look at Marcus himself, his profile sharp against the stars, his eyes scanning the darkness for danger, and she would feel something stir in her heart that she had thought long dead. It was on the 5th night of their journey that they encountered their first real danger. They had stopped to rest in a ruined shepherd's hut, its roof half collapsed but its walls still solid enough to block the wind. Marcus had gone to scout the surrounding area, leaving Eleanor and Edmund alone by a small fire that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Eleanor was dozing when she heard it, the sound of hoofbeats, faint but unmistakable, growing steadily closer. Her eyes snapped open, and she saw Edmund staring at her, his face pale with terror. "They have found us," he whispered. Eleanor's heart hammered in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Stay behind me," she said, rising to her feet and drawing the small knife from her belt. It was a pitiful weapon against mounted men, but it was all she had. The hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Eleanor positioned herself between Edmund and the door, her body tense, her mind racing. Where was Marcus? Had they captured him? Killed him? The door burst open, and a figure filled the frame, tall, broad, silhouetted against the moonlight. Eleanor raised her knife, prepared to fight, prepared to die if necessary. "Peace," said Marcus's voice, rough with exertion. "It is only me." Eleanor's legs gave out beneath her, and she would have fallen if Marcus had not caught her, his strong arms wrapping around her and holding her upright. "Forgive me," he murmured against her hair. "I did not mean to frighten you. I heard riders approaching and circled around to intercept them. They were only travelers, seeking the same shelter we found. I sent them on their way." Eleanor sagged against him, her heart still pounding, her body trembling with the aftermath of fear. She was acutely aware of his warmth, his strength, the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "I thought," she began, but her voice broke, and she could not finish. "I know," Marcus said softly. "I know." For a long moment they stood like that, wrapped in each other's arms, neither willing to be the first to let go. And when at last they separated, Eleanor saw something in Marcus's eyes that she had not seen before. A tenderness, a longing, a question he did not dare to ask. She looked away, her cheeks burning, her heart aching with a confusion of emotions she could not name. If this story has stirred something within you, if you feel the weight of danger, the flutter of unexpected love, the fierce determination to protect the innocent, then pause for just a moment. Leave a comment below with these words. Love finds us when we least expect it. Let those who come after know that this tale reached hearts that still believe in the redemptive power of courage and connection. The days blurred into one another as they traveled north, a tapestry of frozen roads, wind-swept moors, and nights huddled together for warmth in whatever shelter they could find. Eleanor lost track of time, measuring their progress not in miles, but in the gradual softening of Marcus's guarded demeanor and the slow return of color to Edmund's haunted cheeks. Marcus was not what she had expected. She had known knights before, or rather, she had known of them, those armored lords who rode through Ashworth on their way to war or tournament, their noses lifted against the stench of common folk. They were creatures of arrogance and entitlement, more concerned with glory than with honor. But Marcus was different. He treated Edmund not as a prize to be protected, but as a person to be cared for, adjusting the boy's cloak when the wind blew cold, telling him stories of ancient heroes to distract him from his fear, teaching him the names of the stars that wheeled overhead in the clear night sky. And he treated Eleanor with a respect that bordered on reverence, consulting her on decisions, deferring to her judgment in matters of supplies and shelter, never once making her feel like a burden or an afterthought. He was kind. That was what surprised her most. Beneath the scars and the armor and the warrior's bearing, he was genuinely, unexpectedly kind. And Eleanor, who had sworn after William's death that she would never again allow herself to feel anything for any man, found herself feeling a great deal indeed. It was on the 10th night of their journey, in a cave hidden deep within a forest of ancient oaks, that Marcus finally told her his own story. Edmund had fallen asleep hours earlier, exhausted from the day's travel, and Eleanor sat across the fire from Marcus, watching the flames cast shifting shadows across his scarred face. The silence between them was comfortable now, born of shared hardship and mutual trust. "You are wondering about this," Marcus said suddenly, touching the scar on his cheek. "Everyone does, though few have the courage to ask." Eleanor felt her face warm. "I did not mean to stare." "You were not staring. You were observing. There is a difference." He smiled, a rare expression that transformed his stern features into something almost boyish. "I received it the night of the massacre. One of the attackers, a man I had once called friend, struck me with his sword as I tried to reach Edmund's chamber. I fell, and he left me for dead." The smile faded. "I nearly was dead. A serving girl found me in the wreckage and dragged me to safety. She tended my wounds for a week before I was strong enough to ride." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked. "The serving girl?" Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Grief, perhaps, or guilt. "She died. The attackers returned to search the ruins, and she led them away from where I was hidden. They killed her for her trouble." Eleanor felt her heart clench. "I am sorry." "So am I." Marcus's voice was quiet, heavy with the weight of memories. "Her name was Mary. She was 17 years old, and she died because she was brave enough to help a stranger." He looked at Eleanor across the fire, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "It is why I could not stand by when I learned that someone else, a village woman, alone and unprotected, was sheltering Edmund. I had to find you. I had to make sure that what happened to Mary would not happen again." Eleanor understood then, with sudden clarity, what drove this man. It was not duty alone, not loyalty to a dead lord or a dispossessed heir. It was something deeper, a need for redemption, a desperate desire to atone for the lives he had failed to save. "You blame yourself," she said softly. "For Mary, for the others." Marcus was silent for a long moment. "Yes," he said finally. "I was sworn to protect them, and I failed. I was supposed to die with them, and instead, I lived." His jaw tightened. "Do you know what it is like, Mistress Ashford, to survive when everyone you love has perished? To wake each morning with the knowledge that you are still breathing while they are cold in the ground?" "Yes," Eleanor said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "I do." Marcus looked at her sharply. and she saw the question in his eyes. "My husband," she explained. "William. He died 3 winters ago, of the same fever that was sweeping through the village. I nursed him for a week, never leaving his side, and when he finally slipped away, She paused, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. "I wished that I had died with him. For a long time, I wished that I had died with him. But you did not. No, I did not." Eleanor looked at the sleeping form of Edmund, curled beneath his blanket with his thumb in his mouth like the child he still was. "And now I think I understand why. Not because my life has any great purpose or meaning, but because sometimes we are kept alive so that we can be there for someone else. Someone who needs us." Marcus studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor felt the weight of his gaze like a physical touch. "You are a remarkable woman, Eleanor Ashford." It was the first time he had used her given name. The sound of it on his lips, warm, intimate, almost tender, made something flutter in her chest. "I am an ordinary woman," she said, "doing what any person with a heart would do." "No." Marcus rose from his place by the fire and crossed to where she sat. He knelt before her, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his dark eyes, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body through the cold air. "You are extraordinary, and I think perhaps you do not even know it." He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and touched her cheek. His hand was calloused and rough, the hand of a warrior, but his touch was gentle, so gentle that Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes. "Marcus," she whispered. It was all she could say. "I know," he said softly. "I know this is not the time. I know we are hunted, that danger surrounds us, that tomorrow we may be captured or killed. But I need you to know." He stopped, his voice catching. "I need you to know that you have given me something I thought I had lost forever. Hope, purpose, a reason to keep fighting." His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone, wiping away a tear she had not realized she had shed. "You have given me you." Eleanor closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the intensity of what she was feeling. She had spent 3 years building walls around her heart, convincing herself that she was content in her solitude, that she needed nothing and no one. And now, in a cave in the middle of nowhere, with enemies hunting them and uncertainty stretching before them like an endless road, a scarred knight was kneeling at her feet and offering her everything she had been afraid to want. "I am afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I am afraid of losing you. I am afraid of loving you, and then having you taken from me, the way William was taken." "I cannot promise you that I will live," Marcus said. "I cannot promise you safety or certainty or a future free from pain, but I can promise you this. For as long as I draw breath, I will protect you. I will fight for you. I will love you." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers. "And if death comes for me, it will find me with your name on my lips and your face in my heart." Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at him, this fierce, scarred, impossibly tender man, and she made her choice. She closed the distance between them and kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss, not a hesitant exploration of uncertain feelings. It was a claiming, a declaration, a promise made flesh. Marcus's arms came around her, pulling her close, and Eleanor surrendered to the warmth and strength of his embrace. For a long moment, there was nothing in the world but the two of them, no danger, no fear, no past or future. Only the present and the love that had somehow, impossibly, found them both. When at last they pulled apart, breathless and trembling, Marcus rested his forehead against hers and laughed, a soft, wondering sound. "What is it?" Eleanor asked. "I was just thinking," he said, "that I came north to save a lost boy. I did not expect to find a lost heart, my own. Eleanor smiled, her first true smile in longer than she could remember. Perhaps, she said, we were both lost. And perhaps we have both been found. Gee. They reached the priory of St. Hilda on a morning when the sky had finally cleared and the sun shone pale and cold upon a landscape transformed by spring. The snow had melted from the hills, revealing the green shoots of new growth beneath, and the air carried the scent of earth awakening from its long winter sleep. The priory itself was a modest structure of gray stone, nestled in a valley between two high ridges that shielded it from the worst of the northern winds. A bell tower rose above the main building, its bronze bell gleaming in the sunlight, and a garden stretched along the southern wall, already showing the first signs of careful cultivation. Mother Clemence, the prioress, received them in a small chamber warmed by a fire and fragrant with the scent of dried herbs. She was an elderly woman with sharp eyes and a sharper mind, and she listened in silence as Marcus explained their situation, the massacre, the flight, the danger that still pursued them. When he had finished, she turned her penetrating gaze to Edmund, who stood between Eleanor and Marcus with his chin lifted and his shoulders squared, trying his best to look brave. So, she said, you are the Mortimer heir, the boy who would be king if certain men had their way. Edmund flinched at the words, but he did not look away. I do not want to be king, he said quietly. I only want to live. Mother Clemence's expression softened. Then you are wiser than most men who have sat upon that throne. She rose from her chair and crossed to where he stood, placing her weathered hands on his shoulders. You will be safe here, child. These walls have sheltered many secrets over the years, and they will shelter yours as well. She turned to Marcus and Eleanor, and something knowing flickered in her eyes. You two, however, present a different challenge. A knight and a village woman, traveling together, clearly bound by more than duty. She paused, one eyebrow arching. The church has opinions about such arrangements. Eleanor felt her face flame, but Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. We have not dishonored each other, Mother, but you are right that our hearts are entangled. He glanced at Eleanor, and the warmth in his gaze made her breath catch. I intend to marry her if she will have me, as soon as this business is concluded and Edmund is safe. Mother Clemence studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well. You may stay as long as you need. But I warn you, this is a house of God, and I will not tolerate scandal beneath my roof. You will keep separate chambers, and you will conduct yourselves with propriety. Of course, Marcus said, bowing his head. You have my word. The days that followed were the most peaceful Eleanor had known since leaving Ashworth. She spent her time helping in the priory's kitchens, mending the sisters' worn habits, and teaching Edmund the finer points of reading and writing that his interrupted education had left incomplete. Marcus trained in the courtyard each morning, keeping his skills sharp, and spent his evenings with Eleanor and Edmund by the fire, talking and laughing and dreaming of a future that might yet be theirs. But even in this sanctuary, the shadow of danger never quite lifted. Marcus sent messages to trusted allies, seeking information about their enemies' movements, and the responses that came back were troubling. The Earl of Northumberland had not abandoned his search. His men were still combing the countryside, still asking questions, still following leads. It was only a matter of time before one of those leads pointed north. We need to act, Marcus said one evening, as he and Eleanor sat alone in the small garden behind the priory. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and the air was soft with the scent of early blooms. We cannot hide here forever, waiting for them to find us. We need to take the fight to them. Her heart heavy with dread. What do you mean? There are men who would support Edmund's claim, Marcus explained. Lords who remember the Earl of March, who believe that the Mortimer line deserves its rightful place. If I can reach them, rally them to our cause, we could force the king to acknowledge Edmund's rights, to give him the protection of the crown instead of its hostility. And if you cannot? Eleanor asked. If these lords refuse to help, or if the king decides that Edmund is too great a threat to be allowed to live. Marcus was silent for a long moment. Then I will fight, he said finally. I will fight until there is no breath left in my body. Eleanor reached out and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Then I will fight beside you. Marcus turned to her, his eyes dark with emotion. Eleanor, no. This is not your battle. I will not ask you to risk your life for a cause that is not your own. It is my cause, she said firmly. Edmund is my family now, the child of my heart, if not my body. And you. She paused, her voice softening. You are the man I love. Where you go, I go. That is not a request, Marcus, it is a fact. He stared at her for a long moment, and she saw the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to protect her, the fear of losing her, the dawning realization that she would not be dissuaded. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. You are the most stubborn woman I have ever met, he said. I know, Eleanor replied. It is one of my finest qualities. Marcus laughed, a real laugh, full and warm, and pulled her into his arms. God help me, he murmured against her hair. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love. Eleanor closed her eyes and held him close, savoring the warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Tomorrow would bring danger, uncertainty, the possibility of death. But tonight, in this quiet garden with the sun setting and the birds singing, and the man she loved holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world, she was content. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The message arrived on a gray morning in late April, brought by a rider whose horse was lathered with sweat and whose face was pale with urgency. Marcus broke the seal and read the contents, his expression growing darker with every line. When he looked up, his eyes found Eleanor's across the courtyard, and the fear she saw in them made her blood run cold. What is it? She asked, crossing to his side. What has happened? It is from Lord Hastings, Marcus said, his voice tight. One of the men I wrote to. He has news that changes everything. He handed her the letter, and Eleanor read it with growing horror. Lord Hastings had discovered the identity of the man behind the massacre. Not the Earl of Northumberland, as they had suspected, but someone far closer to the throne. Someone with the power and influence to reach them even here, even in this remote sanctuary. The king's own brother. The Duke of Lancaster, Eleanor breathed. He ordered the attack? Marcus nodded grimly. According to Hastings, the Duke has long feared the Mortimer claim. He believes that as long as Edmund lives, there will always be those who question the legitimacy of the Lancastrian dynasty. He decided to eliminate the threat once and for all. Eleanor felt sick. Then we are fighting not just an earl, but a prince of the blood. How can we possibly win? We may not have to fight at all, Marcus said slowly, his mind clearly working through the implications. The Duke acted without the king's knowledge or consent. If we can bring this information to Henry himself, if we can prove what his brother has done, the king will have no choice but to act. He is a man of honor by all accounts. He will not condone the murder of a child, especially one who is his own cousin. But how do we reach the king? Eleanor asked. He is surrounded by guards, by courtiers, by men who may be loyal to the Duke. We cannot simply walk into Westminster and demand an audience. Marcus was silent for a moment, then his jaw set with determination. There is a way. A tournament is to be held next month in London, to celebrate the king's victory over the rebels in the north. Knights from across the realm will compete for honor and glory. If I enter, if I distinguish myself, I may be granted an audience with the king himself. It is too dangerous, Eleanor protested. The Duke will have men at the tournament. They will recognize you. Perhaps, Marcus acknowledged, but it is our best chance, our only chance, to end this once and for all. He took her hands in his grip firm and steady. "Eleanor, I must do this. For Edmund. For us. For the future we want to build together." Eleanor looked into his eyes and saw the resolve there, the willingness to risk everything for the boy they both loved, and she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like iron that she could not stop him, nor would she try. "Then go," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her heart. "Go, and do what must be done, but promise me this. Promise me that you will come back to me." Marcus raised her hands to his lips and kissed them, his eyes never leaving hers. "I promise," he said. "On my honor, on my life, on my love for you. I promise." The tournament grounds outside London were a riot of color and noise, banners snapping in the wind, horses stamping and snorting, crowds cheering and jeering as armored knights clashed in the lists. Eleanor stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart pounding, her eyes fixed on the figure in battered armor who had just entered the arena. Marcus had arrived in London 3 days earlier, under a false name and with his face hidden beneath a helm. He had registered for the tournament as a hedge knight, a landless warrior seeking fortune and fame, and he had fought his way through the preliminary rounds with a skill that had drawn murmurs of admiration from even the most jaded spectators. Now he faced his final opponent, a massive knight in gleaming plate armor whose colors marked him as a man of the Duke of Lancaster's household. The irony was not lost on Eleanor. If Marcus won this bout, he would face the Duke's own champion in the finals. If he lost, he would be at the mercy of men who wanted him dead. The horn sounded, and the two knights spurred their horses forward. Eleanor could not breathe. She could not think. She could only watch as Marcus and his opponent thundered toward each other, lances leveled, the ground shaking beneath the pounding hooves. They met with a crash that echoed across the tournament grounds. Both lances shattered on impact, sending splinters flying through the air, but neither knight was unhorsed. They wheeled their mounts and drew their swords, and the real battle began. It was brutal. It was beautiful. Marcus fought with a grace and ferocity that took Eleanor's breath away, his sword flashing in the sunlight, his movements precise and deadly. His opponent was larger, stronger, but Marcus was faster, smarter, more desperate. He had something to fight for, someone to fight for, and that made all the difference. The bout seemed to last an eternity, but in truth, it was over in minutes. Marcus feinted left, then struck right, catching his opponent's sword arm and sending the weapon spinning away. Before the other knight could recover, Marcus's blade was at his throat. "Yield!" Marcus commanded, his voice ringing across the suddenly silent arena. The knight raised his hands in surrender. The crowd erupted in cheers, and Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of pride, of love so fierce it felt like it might tear her apart. Marcus had won. He had won. But the day was not yet over. The finals were held that afternoon, and Marcus faced the Duke of Lancaster's champion, a knight named Sir Roland, famous throughout the realm for his prowess and his cruelty. The Duke himself was in attendance, seated in the royal box beside the king, his cold eyes fixed on the arena with an intensity that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Marcus fought like a man possessed. He took blow after blow, staggering under the force of Sir Roland's attacks, but he would not fall. He would not yield. Every time Eleanor thought he was finished, he found some reserve of strength she had not known he possessed, and he pushed back, harder, fiercer, more determined than before. And then, in a single stunning moment, it was over. Sir Roland overextended on a thrust, and Marcus seized the opening. His sword caught the champion's blade, twisted it aside, and drove into the gap between helm and gorget. Sir Roland fell, and he did not rise. The crowd went wild. Eleanor pushed through the throng, desperate to reach Marcus, to touch him, to assure herself that he was real and alive and whole. She found him at the edge of the arena, his helm removed, his face streaked with sweat and blood from a cut above his eye. When he saw her, his stern expression cracked, and a smile, brilliant and exhausted and infinitely relieved, spread across his face. "I told you I would come back," he said. Eleanor threw herself into his arms and kissed him, right there in front of the king and the duke and the assembled nobility of England. She did not care who saw. She did not care what they thought. All that mattered was that he was alive, that he was hers, that they had won. When at last they broke apart, Marcus turned toward the royal box and dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty," he called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed arena. "I am Sir Marcus Thorne, once in the service of the Earl of March. I come before you today not to claim a prize, but to seek justice. I carry with me proof of a conspiracy, a plot to murder the young Edmund Mortimer, your cousin and rightful heir to the earldom. A plot orchestrated by your own brother, the Duke of Lancaster." A gasp rippled through the crowd. The Duke's face went white, then red with fury. But King Henry raised a hand, silencing the murmurs, his expression unreadable. "You make grave accusations, Sir Marcus," the king said. "I trust you have evidence to support them." "I do, Your Majesty." Marcus rose and produced the letters Lord Hastings had sent. Correspondence that documented the Duke's orders, his payments to the assassins, his detailed plans for eliminating the Mortimer threat once and for all. The king read them in silence. When he looked up, his face was pale, his eyes blazing with a cold fury that made even Eleanor, who was not its target, take an involuntary step backward. "Brother," Henry said, turning to the Duke of Lancaster, "what say you to these charges?" The Duke spluttered, protested, denied everything. But the evidence was damning, and the king was not a fool. Within the hour, the Duke of Lancaster was under arrest, stripped of his titles and his freedom, and Marcus Thorne was kneeling before the throne, receiving the king's personal thanks for his loyalty and courage. "You have done England a great service," Henry said. "Name your reward, and if it is in my power to grant, it shall be yours." Marcus raised his head, his eyes meeting the king's. "I ask only 3 things, Your Majesty. First, that young Edmund Mortimer be restored to his rightful place as Earl of March, with his lands and titles returned to him. Second, that he be placed under your personal protection, safe from all who would do him harm. And third," he paused, and a faint smile crossed his face, "third, that I be permitted to marry the woman I love." The king raised an eyebrow. "And who is this woman?" Marcus turned and extended his hand toward Eleanor, who stepped forward on trembling legs. "Her name is Eleanor Ashford, Your Majesty. She is the one who found Edmund in the forest, who saved his life and protected him when no one else would. She is the bravest, kindest, most extraordinary woman I have ever known, and I would be honored to spend the rest of my life at her side." Henry studied Eleanor for a long moment, and she forced herself to meet his gaze, to stand straight and tall despite the terror that threatened to buckle her knees. Then the king smiled. "Your requests are granted, Sir Marcus. All 3 of them." He rose from his throne and addressed the assembled crowd. "Let it be known throughout the realm. Edmund Mortimer is restored to his birthright. Sir Marcus Thorne is named his protector and guardian. And the Lady Eleanor Ashford is to be honored as a hero of the crown for her courage and compassion in the face of impossible odds." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Eleanor felt Marcus's arms come around her, holding her close as the world spun and shifted around them. "We did it," she whispered against his chest. "We actually did it." "We did," Marcus agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Together." The wedding took place on a warm day in June, in the chapel of the Priory of St. Hilda, where Eleanor and Edmund had found sanctuary so many months before. Mother Clemence officiated, her stern face softened by what might almost have been a smile, and Edmund stood beside Marcus as his squire, his young face shining with pride and happiness. Eleanor wore a gown of pale blue silk, a gift from the king himself, and flowers woven into her chestnut hair. As she walked down the aisle toward the man who waited for her at the altar, she thought of all the roads that had led her to this moment, The grief that had nearly destroyed her, the child she had pulled from the snow, the knight who had ridden into her life and stolen her heart. She thought of William, too, and she smiled. He would have approved, she knew. He would have wanted her to find happiness again, to open her heart to love, to live fully rather than merely survive. And she had. Against all odds, against all expectations, she had. The ceremony was simple and beautiful, and when Marcus slipped the ring onto her finger and pressed his lips to hers, Eleanor felt something inside her click into place. A piece she had not even known was missing, finally restored. "I love you," Marcus murmured against her lips. "I know," Eleanor replied, smiling, "and I love you." They made their home at March Castle, the ancestral seat of the Mortimer family, now restored to its rightful heir. Edmund flourished under their care, growing into a young man of intelligence, compassion, and quiet strength. He never forgot the lessons of his childhood, the danger, the fear, the desperate flight through hostile country, but he did not let them define him. Instead, he used them to fuel his determination to be a just and honorable lord, one who would never turn away those in need. Eleanor established a home for orphan children on the castle grounds, a sanctuary where the lost and abandoned could find safety, warmth, and love. She named it Ashford House, in memory of the husband who had first taught her to care and the cottage where her new life had begun. And Marcus, scarred, steadfast, devoted Marcus, became everything Eleanor had never dared to hope for. A husband who cherished her. A father who delighted in the children they would eventually have. A partner who stood beside her through triumph and tragedy, joy and sorrow, all the ordinary miracles of a life well lived. On the eve of their first anniversary, Eleanor stood at the window of their chamber, watching the sun set over the hills. Marcus came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Eleanor smiled, leaning back against the solid warmth of his chest. "I am thinking about how strange life is. A year ago, I was a widow in a village, alone and forgotten. I thought my story was over. And now—" She gestured at the scene before them. The castle, the grounds, the distant figures of Edmund and the other children playing in the garden. "Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible." Marcus pressed a kiss to her temple. "You have what you deserve, my love. Nothing more, nothing less." "And what about you?" Eleanor turned in his arms, looking up at him. "What do you have?" Marcus smiled. That rare, beautiful smile that still made her heart flutter after all these months. "I have you," he said simply. "I have Edmund. I have a home, and a purpose, and a love that fills every corner of my soul." He cupped her face in his hands. "I have everything, Eleanor. Everything that matters." She kissed him then, slow and deep, and felt the truth of his words resonate in her bones. They had both been lost once, broken by grief and guilt and the cruelties of a harsh world. But they had found each other, and in finding each other, they had found themselves. And that, Eleanor thought as the last light of day faded into a peaceful darkness, was the greatest miracle of all.